God be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Gospel according to John.
Glory to you,
O God. Jesus went across the Sea of Galilee. A large crowd followed him because they saw the signs he was performing on the sick. Jesus went up to the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. The Jewish feast of Passover was near. When Jesus raised his eyes and saw the large crowd was coming to him, he said to Philip, "Where can we buy enough food for them to eat?" He said this to test him, because he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered, 200 days' wages worth of food would not be enough for each of them to have a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, the brother of Simon Peter, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fishes. But what good are these for so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people recline." Now there was a great deal of grass in that place, so the men reclined, about 5,000 in number. Then Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed them to those who were reclining, and also as much of the fish as they wanted. When they had their fill, he said to the disciples, "Gather the fragments left over, so that nothing will be wasted." So they collected them and filled 12 wicker baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves that had been more than they could eat. When the people saw the sign he had done, they said, "This is truly the prophet, the one who is to come into the world." Since Jesus knew that they were going to come and carry him off to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain alone. The word of the Lord. Praise to you, Jesus Christ. Have a seat. I have a neighbor who's new to the area, probably doesn't realize that she moved to Urbana with our unique culture and people. She had a lovely set of bird feeders that attracted a variety of birds all throughout the year. One day she came over to my garden while I was weeding, and we began to chat. I remarked about how the birds flocked to her feeders. And she responded with annoyance that she felt like she was providing a government assistance program to hungry birds. And she feared that they might become reliant on her charity and forget how to forage for food on their own. I noticed that this year she has no bird feeder. In our first reading and in the gospel today, we hear expressed concern for hungry people. Elisha said to his servant, when presented with 20 loaves of barley bread made from the finest grain and intended as an offering at the temple, "Give it to the people to eat." The people who were starving, for they were in the midst of economic hardship and a period of food insecurity. And with 20 loaves, 100 men were fed, with plenty left over. The story of Elisha is a foreshadowing of the event with Jesus, his followers, and the crowd of 5,000. And in a Moses-like fashion, the gospel writer of John, who intentionally creates these beautiful connections for the reader, places Jesus on a mountain, much as Moses, as he teaches those who have been eager for some sort of sign. A sign that this was indeed the prophet promised to Moses, the one who would rise up from Moses' own people. In the story, we hear of a humble gift of bread and fish, an offertory brought by a child from the little food that he had. Jesus asked the crowd to recline, to assume the position of eating, and to prepare to eat in the grass. We are reminded of Psalm 23. They shall not want. He leads them to green pastures. And as they received their sign, just as Moses led the Israelites out of slavery, and God provided manna from heaven, just as Elijah took what was presented at the temple, multiplying it to feed the crowds, Jesus looked out on the tired and worn faces of those who had followed him and used what there was to make sure that everyone's needs for nutrition were met. Everyone, even those who would one day betray him. Former pastor and political writer John Pavlovich says, Jesus prepared a meal for the multitudes to remind us that we feed people not because we believe they deserve it, but because they're hungry. It's really that simple, isn't it? According to the United Nations in 2022, across the globe, 2.4 billion people experience moderate to severe food insecurity. Currently, the countries of Haiti, Mali, Sudan, South Sudan, and the occupied Palestinian territories have the highest levels of starvation. In the U.S., according to a report by NPR, in 2023, 7 million households had so little food that they often skipped meals. Children who experience food insecurity are more likely to have worsened health outcomes, including cognitive and developmental delays, higher rates of hospitalization, furthering the economic challenges faced by their families. The rates of hunger in Black and Latino households were both more than double the rates for white households in the U.S. Some will say that Jesus' efforts here were to satisfy a different kind of hunger, a hunger for leadership that would dismantle systems of oppression, a hunger for spiritual truths that would lead them back to the God for whom they were a chosen people. And perhaps there's some truth to this, because in the end, the crowd began to talk about how to force Jesus to become their king. But I would contend that what Jesus, Elijah, and Moses all knew was what our friend Abraham Maslow taught us in his hierarchy of needs, that unless the basic human requirements for air, water, food, shelter, sleep, personal security, health, employment, those things that make life sustainable, unless they are met, the higher order capacities that we each hold for love and belonging, self-esteem and self-actualization are simply out of reach. And can we speak for a moment about using food and other provisions to evangelize? To say to people that we are concerned about your survival because we are concerned most about saving your soul, about where you will spend eternity. Talk about holding someone hostage. I'm reminded of two things. I'm reminded first of the way in which the church has attempted to be inclusive with the LGBTQAI community. You are welcome just as you are, and we hope that by being here you might be made straight. That is really a non-affirming way to affirm someone, isn't it? Your value, your worth to us is in you. Your worth to us is in you. changed from who you are today. We hope that by receiving these canned goods, you'll want to be like us, to think like us, to pray like us. And secondly, I'm reminded of a conversation shared with me by one of our former pastors. It was a conversation held with someone from the Congolese community at our parish. She said, "Father, do you think that we come to this parish because we want to become Catholic? If the Presbyterians are offering food and language classes, assistance in finding employment, we will all become Presbyterian. Let us love those whose basic human needs we can meet simply because they are. Just because they are, not for what we hope they might become." This story in John is one of the bread of life readings from the Gospels, and the one story mentioned in each of the 4 books. What does it mean that Jesus is the bread of life? What does that mean to a crowd of 60,000 people who attended the Eucharistic revival and participated in adoration at the Lucas Oil Stadium in Indianapolis? What does the bread of life mean to a man who is lying in the streets of Calcutta, in the rubble in Palestine, or on the corners of our downtown intersections? What does the bread of life mean to a black child whose family is evicted from their home and whose belly rumbles throughout the school day because the only meal he gets is the free lunch that he is provided? I know a man who was that child. His name is Lester, and he grew up not far from here. Lester and I were children in Urbana during the integration of our schools. You see, before 1966, when Lester and I were in the 2nd grade, black and white children went to separate neighborhood schools. Did you know that Urbana was the first community in the state to integrate? Yeah. Black children were bussed out of their neighborhoods and sent to predominantly white schools throughout the community, placing a disproportionate burden on these children. What a frightening thing that must have been when we were all of 7 years old. I met Lester at Leal's school, where the professor's kids went. Most of us walked home for lunch, where our stay-at-home moms were waiting for us with hot meals and warm hugs. Those kids who were bused were sent to the cafeteria to eat from trays or to open their brown bags. Lester told me just last year that his family couldn't afford to send him with a lunch or to purchase a meal from the cafeteria. It was his white teacher who understood that Lester was hungry and didn't have food, who every day would pack a little extra in her lunch, and the 2 of them would sit at her desk and eat. Jesus saw that they were hungry, and he fed them. A few years later, when racial tensions increased in our community and Lester and I were young teens, a crowd of men who were part of the riots going on surrounded me on the school playground. Lester, who was all of 4 feet tall then, he's grown a little bit since, appeared out of nowhere and stood between me and those men and told them to back away. Lester, who is innately good, grew into a kind and gentle man whose call in life is to bring people together, to support and encourage others, and to tell them about the love of God. And he credits much of his capacity to do that to a teacher in the 3rd grade who shared her lunch with him. Sometimes the gospel message is just that simple, isn't it? When I was hungry, you fed me. Amen.